of or accusations against members of either House are not affected. I remind colleagues of Erskine May, paras 2121 and 2124, and in particular that Erskine May, para 2121, makes it quite clear that it is not in order to try to evade those rules by quoting someone else's words. Order. I call Martyn Day to move the motion.
Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petitions 561730 and 576886 relating to honesty in politics. Specifically, both petitions call for it to be a criminal offence if MPs mislead the public or lie in the House of Commons. I am delighted to see you in the chair today, Mrs Murray, and I am equally delighted to be leading this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. It is a pity that perhaps such major events are taking place in the chamber, or we would have had a larger attendance here this afternoon. On a home visit just the other week to Blackburn, West Lothian, my constituent Glenn told me, "The problem with Parliament, it is filled with a shower of lying bees." You can fill in the blank for yourself, but you get the picture. In politics, public perception is everything, even more so when the public are rightfully scunnered by the actions of some bad apples and by the non-correction of genuine mistakes. So addressing the issue is therefore crucial for all of us if we want to restore public trust in our democratic processes. The Petitions Committee had to request a revised government response to the first petition, make it a criminal offence for MPs to mislead the public, because it did not think the government's original response directly addressed the request of this petition. The government's revised response stated categorically that it did not intend to introduce legislation, citing the MP's Code of Conduct and the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards as suitable substitutes. However, I met with the Constitution Unit, the Institute for Government and Full Fact ahead of this debate, and we all agree that these are not an appropriate mechanism to deal with the problem of MPs misleading the public or lying in Parliament. That the government had to be asked for a response that actually addressed the petition's request is an indication that this issue was not given due and proper consideration. I hope today's debate will correct that, and that agreement can be reached on how we achieve a mechanism that alleviates the existential high public concern over MPs misleading Parliament. Both petitions are now closed, and over 2 years have passed since the government responded to them. I will refer to the responses further during my speech. First, though, it is appropriate at this early juncture to state the obvious. Events have passed relating to this matter since the responses were given. Indeed, I will discuss one of these events at length to demonstrate how the current Commons procedures actually hinder MPs' accountability if they mislead or lie. It will be interesting to learn whether the responding minister today agrees with the government's historic responses, or if the passage of time and related events have since been given due consideration. By way of background, it is relevant to note that this debate was originally scheduled to take place on the 6th of June 2022. However, this was delayed due to the related event I will raise, an investigation being carried out by the Committee of Privileges on a matter referred to it about the conduct of the former Prime Minister and member for Uxbridge and South Ruslip, Mr Boris Johnson. This concerned whether Mr Johnson misled the House of Commons and if, in its nature, his conduct amounted to a contempt. Now, that is an important word that I will return to very shortly. I raise the Privileges Committee's inquiry because its investigation on 6 gatherings between the 20th of May 2020 and the 14th of January 2021 at number 10 Downing Street during Mr Johnson's residency substantiate the petitioner's concerns, even though these gatherings were not public knowledge when the petitions were started in November 2020 and April 2021. I recently met with Mr Bacchus, the creator of petition 561730, Make It a Criminal Offence for MPs to Mislead the Public, and asked him what led him to start this petition more than 1 year before the allegations that COVID rules had been broken in number 10 emerged. He told me it was due to the lies that had been told in relation to Brexit and that he had been influenced by the failed legal challenge that Mr Johnson had repeatedly lied and misled the British public as to the cost of EU membership. I'm spotting a pattern here. Mr Bacchus believes if MPs intentionally or recklessly does not speak the truth or misrepresents facts, then they should face sanctions in the same way that other public servants would. Therefore, it is simple. As public servants, MPs should also face tangible accountability, and Mr Bacchus further believes that this would improve the quality of our politics. I'm inclined to agree with him. He shared his disappointment in what he described as the government's expected response to his petition, and revealed his intention that the anticipated expected response would put on record and thereby highlight the poor quality of UK politics. I agree that the response reflected the current poor quality of our politics. Mr Bacchus added that he understood it was not in the government's interest to face sanctions for misleading people. I believe self-interest should not be so apparent when the government is supposed to serve the country and MPs are elected to serve their constituents. And Mr Bacchus agrees, pointing out it is in the interest of the voters that MPs are expected to tell the truth due to the impact they have on other people's lives. He believes MPs are guardians of the morals and standards that create a civilised society and should set an example to which the population aspires. In his own words, Mr Bacchus said, if MPs cannot be relied upon to maintain those standards, why should the electorate maintain them? The passive attitude towards dishonesty in politics opens the door to the breakdown of civilised society. Who then can argue against improving the quality of our politics? I thank Mr Bacchus and all the petitioners for making today's very important debate possible. After allegations became known about the Downing Street gatherings in December 2021, Mr Johnson proceeded to make over 30 statements between then and May 2022 to the House of Commons about compliance with COVID rules and regulations in number 10. The Privileges Committee concluded that Mr Johnson's statements misled the House, and it shared its provisional conclusions with him on the 8th of June 2023, inviting him to make further representations. This led to Mr Johnson announcing his intention to resign the next day, with his resignation being confirmed 3 days later. That he made a statement ahead of the committee's final report being published on the 15th of June, knowing the committee would not be able to respond publicly, is significant. Indeed, Mr Johnson's conduct on the 9th of June was considered in itself a very serious contempt, which brings me back to the importance of this word. It strikes me that in this context the word is important for two main reasons. First, the House of Commons initially referred the matter to the Committee of Privileges to consider whether Mr Johnson's statements amounted to a contempt. The reason for this is that the concept of the word in parliamentary terms refers to a contempt of privilege, which describes any act that might disrupt Parliament's work. Additionally, the committee's final report used it repeatedly, indicating its thoughtful consideration, and concluded Mr Johnson's conduct was deliberate and he has committed a serious contempt of the House. When the final report came to the Commons for debate on the 19th of June, it was again used multiple times by cross-party members. On that day, I joined 353 other members in approving the committee's findings. And this is an opportune moment to thank all members of the Privileges Committee for their diligent work in producing its final report. To be clear, the committee found that the work of the House had been frustrated by the highest office of government, and the House of Commons agreed with its findings. The second main reason is that the seriousness of these findings does not reflect the consequences when expulsion from the House is the worst penalty a member can face when they do not speak truthfully in Parliament. Being expelled from the House pales in comparison to the penalties for committing a contempt of court, which can see someone going to prison for up to 2 years, getting a fine, or both. Being expelled from the House pales in comparison to the legal framework for coronavirus restrictions and fixed penalty notices, some of which amounted to thousands of pounds that ordinary members of the public had to pay. And let us bear in mind that a false statement in court amounts to perjury, or lying under oath, a crime treated with great seriousness because the very foundation of the legal system depends on trust and credibility. Remember, too, that many cases of perjury lead to justice being perverted. I consider the very foundation of democracy also depends on trust and credibility, and that democracy must not be perverted, especially by those who have been entrusted to defend it. Therefore, why should lying in Parliament not be treated with the same seriousness? Contempt is usually associated with legal jargon, defined as a disobedience to or disrespect for the rules or orders of a court or legislative body. Now, the House of Commons is, of course, not a court, but it is a legislative body that debates and passes new laws and changes to the existing laws as required. It is the government that introduces most plans for these laws, and the government actively seeks out public commitment for some of the legislative change that it wishes to pursue. For that reason, the government should be cognisant that in this case the roles are perhaps reversed, and the public is asking it to introduce legislation to make lying in the House of Commons a criminal offence. Why should it not comply with this reasonable request? After all, it is a collectively held will for the common good that forms the political legitimacy of the social contract and determines we should all live by a common rule. Why should introducing legislation to make lying in the House of Commons a criminal offence be opposed? Or is it indeed a case of one rule for them and another rule for everyone else? Both petitions are clear that trust, truth and honesty are crucial elements in a modern democracy, and that lying in Parliament should carry the same penalties as lying in court. I agree with these sentiments of the nearly 244,000 people who felt compelled to sign the petitions. As members take an oath before they can take their seat in the House, just as anyone does ahead of appearing in court, the same principle should be applied to this legislative body as in a court. Let us look again at the government's response that states, once elected to Parliament, all MPs must abide by the 7 principles of public life, which form the basis of ethical standards expected of holders of public office. These are set out by the Committee on Standards in Public Life and are selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. Now, honesty is there, but it begs the question, should truthfulness be introduced as an 8th principle in public life, just for the avoidance of doubt? The MP's Code of Conduct states, members have a duty to uphold the law, and it is part of the Parliamentary Commissioner's job to oversee the Code of Conduct. Yet, despite the Government's response, citing the MP's Code of Conduct and the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards as suitable substitutes to legislation, it is noted in the procedural protocol in respect of the Code of Conduct that the Commissioner cannot investigate allegations solely about breaches of the 7 principles of public life. Can someone please enlighten me on what sense this myriad of procedures makes? We only have to look at the length of time between public concerns being raised over Boris Johnson misleading the public and his referral to the Committee of Privileges to see that the hurdles to achieve this are very high. As the Director of the Constitution Unit points out, in any less extreme case, even triggering an investigation to examine the facts might have proved politically impossible. Would it not just be more straightforward for lying in Parliament to be an offence? The UK Government should take a number of petitioners that want the legislative change as a clarion call that legislative change is not just desired, but it is absolutely necessary. We must never forget that we are elected by people across the UK to represent their interests and concerns, not our own. We must never forget that as MPs, our primary privilege is that we are elected to serve our constituents, not ourselves. We must also never forget that one of our duties, as laid out in the MP's Code of Conduct, is that we should act on all occasions in accordance with the public trust placed in us. At the very least, that must mean being truthful. It is a sign of the backwards nature of the Westminster system that in February 2022, after both of these petitions had closed, and it was obvious to many that lies had been told, the previous SNP Westminster leader was forced to leave the chamber for telling the truth. whilst at the same time the Prime Minister, who happens to be the guardian of the ministerial code, was able to use his position to spread misleading information and rebuke facts through lies, without recourse or accountability. The honourable member for Brent Central was also earlier ejected for calling Boris Johnson a liar, expelled for telling the truth. The madness this places a strain on both members' parliamentary records for getting it right. Can the Minister today put it on the record if either member has even received an apology? When the House of Commons rules ejects members from the chamber for calling out dishonesty, then the rules are clearly not working. Parliamentary privilege grants members the right to speak freely without fear of legal liability or other reprisal. However, that privilege has been abused, and that abuse goes against our code of conduct with little repercussion. We should grab this opportunity to examine the challenges and complexities of this matter and come together to find a solution that works. Legislation should be brought forward that prevents the trust between government and those who are governed being further eroded. And this should be done at the earliest opportunity so that we can move the backward nature of this Parliament forward. Thank you.
Question is that this House has considered e-petitions 561730 and 576886. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mrs Murray, and it is an honour to serve under your chairship. It's the case that just 1 in 6 people in the UK, that's 17% of the British public, who were polled last year, said that they were highly satisfied with how democracy is working. And I'm afraid that compares very badly with some of our friends and neighbours, the likes of Canada and Germany, where 36% of the public say the same thing of their governments. So quite clearly, we, whether we're in government or opposition, need to take a careful look at issues of honesty and trust in government. And I'd just like to pay tribute to the honourable member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. I think the points that he was raising about Partygate are absolutely central to this issue. And I would like to extend just one of those points now, if I may. On the 12th of April 2022, the Metropolitan Police served a fixed penalty notice on the then Prime Minister and the then Chancellor of the Exchequer for attending a rule-breaking event in the Cabinet Office in June 2020. Now, just 2 days later, newspapers were full of this dramatic news when the government announced the so-called Rwanda Partnership. And whatever you think about the Rwanda Partnership, this £120 million scheme that would see some asylum claimants having their claims processed while they're in Rwanda, it is, at the very least, newsworthy. And I think the point here is that we have been subject, increasingly over the last couple of decades, to something that started out as spin that has since become verging on the dishonest. So if I take you back to September the 11th, 2001, we heard the phrase used that it is a good day to bury bad news. And this was symbolic at the time of the worst aspects of the dark arts of spin. But what we've seen since that time is the development of this into an election campaigning technique. So now we hear about the dead cat strategy. This idea of dead catting, where when something inconvenient is in the news headlines, the masters of spin might slap a dead cat in front of the public, a shocking announcement to divert attention away from those inconvenient headlines of the day. And honourable and right honourable members, I think it is time to end a good day to bury bad news. It's time to end the dead cat strategy. It is a good day to bury the dead cat. We need more honesty in public life. If the public considered that MPs only tell the truth because it has become a criminal offence to do so, that would actually reduce trust in MPs. I pay tribute to the people who've put this petition together, and I pay tribute also to the more than 100,000 people who signed the petition. I would say if we were to adopt these measures, we would need to be very careful about a couple of things. Firstly, we'd need to be careful that if it became a criminal offence for MPs to lie in Parliament, what about when MPs were thought to have not told the truth outside of Parliament? And could that actually, by contrast, reduce trust in MPs when they were speaking in other places, such as in the media or in meetings in MPs' constituencies? The other thing that really worries me about the idea of making lying an offence for which you could be prosecuted is what we see in some other countries where political prisoners are made of people who are simply practising as opposition politicians. And of course, this is taking the risk to the extremes, but I do worry about the idea that opposition politicians could simply get locked up for telling the truth. But actually, we shouldn't need this. We should be able to proceed on the basis of honour. And of course, this is a term that goes in front of our constituencies. We are the honourable, or the right honourable member for the constituency that we represent. And it seems to me that we do need now more than just simply a code of conduct or a code of honour on which to have ourselves bound by truth. We've seen, back in the days of Boris Johnson, this terrible technique of making a wild claim that is amplified by denial. So my political opponent makes a claim that I know to be untruthful, and in denying it, I'm repeating it, and in repeating it, I am amplifying it. And we've got to beware of these partial truths, because these partial truths are getting us into great political hot water. I'll give you an example. I'll give honourable and right honourable members an example. The 40 new hospitals that were claimed would be delivered in this Parliament in the manifesto in 2019 by the Conservative government. We heard talk of 40 new hospitals, and since then I've heard that they aren't hospitals, there aren't 40 of them, and they're not new. And so instead what I see in my own constituency, that the community hospital at Seaton is under threat, with suggestions that we might be seeing a wrecking ball brought to demolish part of the community hospital at Seaton. We need honesty and integrity that underpins our democracy. As politicians, we've got a job not only to call out fake news, but to stand up and act with integrity. Over recent years, we've seen a dangerous rise in misleading statements from political parties, from politicians, and clearly the public feel that there is distortion going on. Research from the organisation Full Fact showed that 71% of the public believe there is more lying and more misuse of facts now in politics than there was 30 years ago. And yet, the Constitution Unit found that the public admire politicians who are prepared to stand up and admit mistakes rather than being dishonest about them. On top of this, we've had a wave of sleaze and scandals emanating from the Conservative Party, and it was one such scandal that brought me to office as a Member of Parliament for Tiverton and Honiton. In this place, we've got a mechanism for correcting the record, for correcting inadvertent errors by going before Parliament, but actually what we need is a better method for MPs to be able to correct Hansard, rather than just simply things being distorted and then sent viral over social media. We've got to now be very wary also of politicians who cook up half-baked proposals, pretend that they were meaningful policy, and then claim that they've scrapped them. And I take as a case in point the Conservative Party conference earlier this year, where ideas around 7 bins were magicked up. There was a time when the office of Prime Minister was that of statesman, and I'm afraid to stoop this low is almost to stoop to the level less of statesman, more of binman. It's deceitful. It's against the Nolan principles. I will give way.
Most of what he said I agree with, but does he recognise that some of the solutions that he proposed already exist, and we are in the condition that we are? They don't work. That somehow or other we need to shift the dial and stop within the politics of the United Kingdom rewarding those who say what they like and get away with it, and reward those rather who stick by the truth.
Well, I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and she's exactly right. We absolutely need to put on a pedestal those people who are prepared to stand up and admit when they've made a mistake and to applaud those who say things that correct their own record. I think one other aspect before I close, I'm seeing increasingly is neighbouring MPs claiming credit for the work and the achievements of some of the community campaigners who are working in my part of Devon. And it's sometimes said of flattery. You know, this is I think that flattery is clearly at play here. You know, the mimicry is a form of flattery. But I think what we're seeing here is actually against the Nolan principles of honesty and accountability. So finally, I think for anyone who's joined the House of Commons chamber at the start of proceedings, we need to remember that part of the prayer that we listen to every day, that we pray that members are granted that they never lead the nation wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but lay aside all private interests and prejudices and keep in mind their responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I call the next speaker, can I gently remind members that accusations of dishonesty against currently sitting MPs should be made via the proper channels and not in a debate on a general motion. I call Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Murray. I wasn't intending to make any allegations about any sitting members. I might refer to a couple of former sitting members and others, but it's a great delight to have you in the chair, and it's a great delight to have this debate. I mean, it's only a sadness that, of course, this debate in here is in competition with very, very serious matters in the chamber of the House of Commons this afternoon. Because there is an irony, you know, Mrs. Murray, which is it is the fundamental assumption of the House of Commons that every single member always speaks the truth, to the best of their knowledge, their understanding and ability. Of course, sometimes we get things wrong by mistake, we accidentally misspeak and all the rest of it, but that is the fundamental assumption of the House of Commons, that every single member always speaks the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. However, it is the absolute presumption of every single member of the public these days that every time a member of Parliament opens their mouth, whether in the House of Commons or outside Parliament, we are lying. I cannot tell you, Mrs. Murray, how many times I've heard this. You know, we've all known it. We've all seen it on the Twitter sphere. I can't bring myself to call it X anymore. It seems a very odd name. It is the working assumption of lots of people. And it is considerably worse than when I first arrived in the House. I can't remember when you first arrived, Mrs. Murray, but I arrived in 2001. I think I'm the longest standing member in the House. Here this afternoon, and it was nowhere near that bad back in 2001. The statistics have got worse in every decade since the Second World War, and they are now at catastrophically low levels of trust in what politicians say, and that is truly problematic. Of course, as I said earlier, we all make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I've had to correct the record several times. Entirely inadvertently. Sometimes one says million when one meant billion. Sometimes one gets the name of a country wrong. These things happen. Sometimes I've said Labour when I meant Conservative, or Conservative when I meant Labour. And just sometimes you do have to correct the record. It's actually not that easy for a backbench member. There isn't, at the moment, a formal process for us to do so. You can do a point of order, though sometimes you do feel a bit... I mean, I know I can be pompous anyway, Mrs. Murray, but you do feel but you do feel phenomenally pompous when you're raising a point of order about some minor correction of the record. And you kind of think that you're wasting the whole of the House's time. So I really do hope that tomorrow afternoon we vote through this amendment to allow the correction of the record process which we introduced in government in 2007, which only applies to ministers, so that it applies to all backbench members. Because we all know times when we would have been able to correct the record. And the good thing about it is that it corrects the original moment in Hansard. Whereas if, Mrs. Murray, I were to say something foul about a member of your family, I wouldn't be able to say it about you because, you know, the rules that you've already laid out. But if I were to say something foul about a member of your family, because I believed it to be true, but subsequently found it to be untrue, it would still stand in the original Hansard as it is at the moment, even if I corrected the record 2 days later. Whereas I hope with the motion, if the motion goes through tomorrow, we'll be able to correct that problem that we have in the present system. The honourable member who spoke at the beginning, who did so very eloquently, incidentally, and I'm very grateful to him for speaking on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I think his heart was in it as well. He wasn't just doing it for the Petitions Committee. He referred to the term bad apple. Now, I dislike this term because I think people think it means, oh, there are just some bad apples, but everybody else is okay. But that has never been the meaning of the proverb. It goes all the way back to Chaucer, and I think it's the Cook's Tale, where one of the pilgrims refers to the one bad apple spoiling the whole barrel. That's the point, where you just have to have one bad apple to spoil the whole barrel. And I honestly think that that is what has happened in this Parliament. We need to be terribly cognizant of the fact that 25 MPs in this Parliament since 2019 have been suspended for a day or more, or have left Parliament before a report into their misconduct was produced to the House. 25 out of 650 of us. That is a record by a country mile. And the Clerk of the House tells me that a country mile means as far as you can see to the horizon into the distance. So, I honestly think it's become normalised for some of our colleagues. I'm not going to refer to specific individuals, but the whole idea of a meat tax theoretically being proposed by the Labour Party, which has never, ever been proposed by the Labour Party, is a flat-out, blatant lie.
What do you point?
Of course.
Yeah. And this is why it's so critical, because it is the advantages that become associated with the influence that you can gain under lies that we have to challenge, because otherwise the individual is being rewarded by throwing a lie out there and not bringing it, and in no way are they penalised for bringing it back again. And that, in the sense of it affecting all of us and polluting our whole politics, is why we need to address this in a way that presently the House does not seem to have sufficient resources.
No, I completely agree. And I think that this Parliament, or the next Parliament, if this Parliament doesn't get round to do it, will have to address this issue far more seriously than we have heretofore. And I'll come on to some of the problems, I think, with the present system in a moment. I commend her for having brought forward a suggestion on how to deal with it. She's not the only member. There's a member from my own party who's done the same. I'll explain why I disagree with the precise route that she wants to go down, but I don't disagree with what she's seeking to change. And incidentally, what I said about meat tax, you could say the same about 7 bins and so on. And it's a legitimate point that was just made by the honourable member speaking from the Liberal Democrat benches, which is that the public doesn't draw an enormous distinction between whether an MP has lied in Parliament or has lied out of Parliament. They just think that we all lie all of the time, and pretty much the moment we open our lips start moving, we are all lying. And that is surely problematic for the whole of democracy. We have another problem, which was alluded to by the honourable member for Linlithgow, which is that, sorry, I'm Falkirk East, which is that we have a rule that you cannot say that somebody else has lied unless the motion is specific on the order paper. That is what we are debating. I remember some people got awfully excited in the chamber when people started saying that Boris Johnson had lied, when the motion on the order paper was whether Boris Johnson had lied. And of course you've got to be able to advance that argument and prosecute that case in such a debate. But we have an assumption that you cannot say that a member has deliberately lied. You have to say inadvertently, even though we all know every time somebody says, oh, he has inadvertently lied, that the person who is saying inadvertently lying is actually lying because they really believe that they haven't inadvertently lied at all. They have absolutely advertently lied and deliberately and recklessly done so. And so we then throw that person out of the chamber for a day if they refuse to retract the point. Now, I don't want us to get to a place where basically we spend all our time accusing each other of being a liar. That is a very inelegant way of our doing our business. and I don't think it would enhance the political debate in this country. But I think we are going to have to review this rule at some point. It is also a particular irony that 2 members of Parliament, as was referred to earlier, were thrown out of the chamber for calling Boris Johnson a liar when, A, Boris Johnson patently was a liar, and secondly, he was subsequently found to have misled the House on precisely the grounds that had been adduced by the 2 members concerned. And yet they end up being in the list of bad MPs. They're in my list of 25, just as anybody else's. So I think we'll have to review that. The second point is, it is even more important that a minister tells the truth, as I said earlier, insofar as they know it to be the truth, and insofar as they are able to access the truth, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because, they have an army of advisers to make sure that what they are saying is true, and to tell them, if they need to correct the record, that they must correct the record. Secondly, because decisions are made on spending and on public policy on the basis of what ministers say in the chamber. And thirdly, because it's a fundamental principle of good government, and indeed it is written into the ministerial code that ministers must always tell the truth. Now, I honestly think 98% of the time, ministers do tell the truth. I know lots of ministers who are very rigorous with themselves and with their team about making sure that, can I really say that? Is that really true? Is that a correct interpretation of the statistics? But there are others who perhaps are a little more casual around the use of statistics, or so careful that it amounts effectively to misleading. But that's why it's so important that ministers have the opportunity to correct the record and should do so, and they do it hundreds of times every year. Hundreds of times. Ironically enough, Boris Johnson only did it once. This is when he told the House, when asked by the Leader of the Opposition whether Roman Abramovich was sanctioned, just after the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Boris Johnson told the House that yes, he was sanctioned. And I quizzed him again, and he said yes, he was sanctioned. And the next day, he corrected the record to say that no, Roman Abramovich was not sanctioned. I mean, he was subsequently, but he wasn't yet. And it just seems a little odd that the only time that Boris Johnson chose to correct the record was the time when a Russian lawyer with very, very deep, oligarch with very deep pockets and very expensive lawyers to hand called on him and made him correct the record. As I said earlier, Mrs Murray, I think this system of correcting the record should be made available to all members, and I hope the motion is carried tomorrow. I'm fairly confident that it will. But I do have a question to ask, really, which is, what are we to think if a minister keeps, or a series of ministers keeps on repeating something, using a statistic, for instance, which is false? And we know it to be false because the Office of National Statistics, who are a pretty dry set of people, not all that interested in getting into the party political argy-bargy, writes to the minister to say, thou shalt not use this statistic because it is not true anymore. I have a simple answer, Mrs Murray. I think that if the Office of National Statistics writes to a minister to say that they must not say that again, and copies it into the Speaker, if the minister has not corrected the record within 28 days, they should automatically be considered to have breached the Code of Conduct. And then the Committee of Standards can decide how important and significant the issue is. I think that's the... And frankly, if a minister was in such a situation, the first time they got caught out with that, and was suspended probably from the House by the Committee on Standards, I suspect they would never do it again. That's the kind of measure I suspect that we need to introduce. The present system, of course, is that you have to refer the matter of whether an individual member has lied to the Committee of Privileges. That is phenomenally cumbersome. For a start, you've got to get the whole House to vote in favour of it. And so it's pretty unlikely, in the main, that government members, who are by definition are in the majority, will vote for a reference to the Committee of Privileges for a government minister of their own, let alone a Prime Minister. It's happened once. I suspect it's unlikely to happen again. It's a very long procedure and cumbersome. It requires the Speaker to grant permission for the reference to the Committee on Privileges, and I just think that we need to reform that. I note yet another irony, that when the DCMS Select Committee found, in essence, that Nadine Dorries had lied to its committee, it decided not to seek a reference to the Committee on Privileges. I guess because they thought it was just too cumbersome and too tedious a process. But I think we probably need to make this process simpler and not necessarily to require a committee of the whole House to do it. I just want to refer briefly, Mrs Murray, to the government's response to these e-petitions today. It says, "It is an important principle of the UK Parliament that members of Parliament are accountable to those who elect them. It is absolutely right that all members of Parliament are fully accountable to their constituents for what they say and do, and this is ultimately reflected at the ballot box." Well, yes, sort of. But I'm conscious I represent the Rhondda. It's the only seat in Parliament which has been Labour since 1885, and I hope it was being redrawn at the next election. But my point is simply that I think some MPs are more accountable to their electorates than others, because we have a first-past-the-post system, which means that many MPs are sitting in very safe seats. And that means that they are not as accountable to everybody else, which is why it is all the more incumbent on us as a whole House to take these issues very, very seriously. We can't just leave all of these issues to the ballot box. Mrs Murray, there are various solutions that have been suggested on how we should go down, how we should sort this out. One is that the Speaker should intervene, should decide. I regularly see people on Twitter condemning poor old Lindsay for not having told off such and such a minister for lying. Well, that's not fair. The Speaker, you can't have the Speaker deciding on the accuracy or inaccuracy of individual comments made by any members of the House. That way madness lies. So I fully support not giving that power to the Speaker. I think that would be unfair. There's an argument that there should be a criminal offence. I understand that. However, let me take the case of Roman Abramovich. I said in the chamber, I used parliamentary privilege to make some allegations about Roman Abramovich, which I think enabled the government to proceed with eventually sanctioning him under the Ukraine sanctions regime. Now, he has very expensive lawyers, I'm sure. I'm sure he would seek, in that set of circumstances, where I think I was doing the right thing, I was operating under the other principle we have, that all members should speak without fear or favour, and of course guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, which says in Article 9 that no proceeding in Parliament should be questioned or impeached in any court of law or in any other place, which guarantees that the things that we say in Parliament cannot be sued in another place. I think it's important that we maintain that, because otherwise he would have been seeking some kind of criminal prosecution for me. And actually, I think we have to use this power judiciously as MPs and carefully, and I admit that sometimes I've got this wrong as well, but we have to have that in place, I think, to make sure that we have a fully functioning system, which is, and the other point I'd make about a criminal offence is, it won't deal with what happens outside Parliament. It's quite difficult to start having MPs being brought to court for what they may or may not have said, on Twitter or whatever, unless they are inciting violence or breaking another law. But also, you need to bear in mind that sometimes two people can see the same event and read the same event completely differently, quite legitimately. I mean, the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, well, Matthew and Luke have completely different versions of the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, whether Jesus is standing up or sitting down, and whether it's blessed are you poor or blessed are the poor in spirit, and so on. It's a frivolous remark in one sense, but it's deadly serious, which is I really don't want the courts to be spending and for that matter, the police to be spending all their time analysing whether something is proportionate, whether it's deliberate, and so on. So that's why I'm not in favour of a criminal offence. However, I do think that the offence of misconduct in public office is ripe for reform. It's sort of been around for a very long time. It's rarely used. I'm not aware of it ever having been applied to a member of Parliament. But there is an argument to say that in certain circumstances, if you were to bring in a statutory offence of misconduct in public office, then it should apply to members of Parliament. Final 2 points. The first is, I cannot tell you, Mrs. Murray, how many times I have been told on television programmes, or I've heard on television programmes or radio programmes during this Parliament, the public doesn't care about standards in public life. This is all just Westminster tittle-tattle and all that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, that is so, so wrong. And if we don't care about it, the public certainly do care about it. I would gently suggest that the by-elections last week point to a public that genuinely cares about standards in public office and lying. And let's not forget, Boris Johnson was referred to the Committee on Standards over what he'd said about parties in Downing Street. He wasn't referred to Downing Street about to the Committee on Privileges about what he said about Chris Pincher, which was actually what brought him down. But that was another set of lies, and there could be a whole, dozens of different issues that could have been sent to the Committee on Privileges if necessary. As the honourable member who spoke for the Liberal Democrats said earlier, he's absolutely right. Member for Somerset and Somerton and Frome. Yes? Tiverton and Honiton, sorry, apologies. He's absolutely right that the Citizens' Assembly on Democracy, which has done a lot of work on this, found that by far the number one thing that they sought in a Member of Parliament was honesty in politics. It's by far their number one category that they would quality that they want to see in a member. And their favourite option is throwing members out of Parliament if they lie to Parliament. With all the caveats that I've expressed earlier about sometimes we make mistakes and so on. But if you refuse to correct the record, that is by definition then a willful misleading of Parliament. And this is my final point. Why does all of this matter? Well, I think democracy, in the end, if people start losing trust in democracy, whether that leads to them not voting or starting to believe, well, you know, it's a lot more efficient just to have an autocrat decide, as has happened in other places in Europe in recent years, then we have lost one of our fundamental freedoms and one of the things that makes this country very special. I think at the moment Parliament is on trial, and the linchpin of all of this is around whether MPs tell the truth or whether they lie, and whether we, the rest of the House, care when a member lies, and whether we'll do anything about it.
Thank you. Can I just gently remind members that it's appropriate to refer to Mr. Speaker as Mr. Speaker and not his Christian name? I call Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Cadeirydd. Thank you very much, Chair. And I also thank my friend, the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and Falkirk East, for bringing this e-petition. And it's been really interesting to follow the previous speakers. Westminster Hall does have the advantage of being a place where you feel like you're actually debating something rather than just standing up and saying a set of series of words, although it is disappointing that there are so few of us here, although I understand, of course, the circumstances and the other statement that was, previous to the one now. Other people have touched on matters such as Partygate, and it does strike me, of course, that it's timely that Partygate was broadcast by Channel 4 a couple of weeks ago, even though this debate actually is over a year later than we anticipated it was going to be. And I think that Partygate did remind people, and we are seeing this playing out in the by-elections, of that real visceral shock of how many, many, many people behaved during COVID and how it played out like a slow disaster movie, that actually people were behaving in a completely different way at a time when we had taken the Prime Minister on his word, we had given up our liberties, and it was a shock to see that people could behave in such a different way, not just in breaking the rules, but that when it came to justifying their actions, also dispensing with the truth when it came to those justifications. And we've also seen it during the conference recess. We've seen this concept of the meat tax, of the 7 different bins for separating our refuse. a claim that people purport to be gay to gain asylum. And we were also even given what we were told in relation to HS2 were concrete spending plans, only to be told a convenient couple of days later that actually these were illustrative. How do you believe what's being told under these circumstances? In Wales, we've had the 20 miles an hour legislation, and some politicians have been dubbing that as a blanket. Now, in my own county, there are 85 exceptions to this. So how can it be a monolithic imposition unless what we have here is not a nuanced interpretation of various political standpoints, but it is lying for the sake of division and to stoke emotions? And if it is that in action, then we need to take a step back and wonder where it's going to land us. So, as a number of honourable members have previously mentioned, I have brought up a private member's bill before Parliament to make it an offence for politicians to willfully lie to the public. This is, of course, as many private members' bills are, an opportunity to talk about the gravity of the situation and the pros and cons of what we can actually do to address it. Because I think everyone who has spoken so far, agrees that it needs to be addressed. The name of the bill, the Elected Representatives Prohibition of Deception Bill, would bring Parliament in line with 21st century standards and make it an actionable offence for MPs, members of devolved legislatures, police and crime commissioners and elected mayors wittingly to lie in their public statements. So this would include public pronouncements on social media, on broadcasts, podcasts, printed election material. And if found guilty, according to the bill, they could face an unlimited fine and be banned for up to 10 years from standing for election. And yes, those would be serious sanctions, evidently. The question is, what sort of sanctions do we need that will actually bring about a change? Now, the bill provides safeguards to ensure that only those who willfully lie are held to account and police time is not wasted on frivolous tit-for-tat or malicious accusations. And of course, national security concerns would be safeguarded. And I think, as honourable members have previously mentioned, we all make mistakes. What we haven't got is a culture that drives admission of making mistakes. We are actually penalised more for admitting our mistakes than we are for correcting them. And that is, to a degree, self-perpetuating. And my party has been calling for such an act for a long time. The member of Senedd, Adam Price, who was the MP for Carmarthen East and Dynevor back in 2006, he presented a bill relating to the misleading of the public over an illegal war in Iraq. It's astonishing that 17 years later nothing has changed. And a 2022 survey by Compassion in Politics found that 73% of people supported my bill, including 71% of Conservative voters and 79% of Labour supporters. And I think these e-petitions today, they show that there is real public support for accountability and integrity, and that purposeful dishonesty and deception should have consequences. Which brings the question, and this is why I was holding myself back from not doing interventions, because I thought you are going to talk about this, so do it with a bit more decorum and dignity and perhaps a bit more pace. So why legislation rather than a protocol? Well, firstly, let's remember that there is consumer protection legislation in place in relation to the descriptions of goods and services and, of course, in relation to advertising. And what is advertising but another industry, if you like, compared to us as politicians, which deals in influencing people, and that we do endeavour to control how we influence people in terms of what is true and what is unacceptable falsehood. Also, why legislation rather than protocol? Because gentlemen's agreements only work between gentlemen who play by the rules. When there is a culture of disapplying the rules in relation to people who consider themselves to be, let us say, world kings, we need something more robust than codes of conduct. The ministerial code, and I want particularly to look at this one, in essence, is as strong as the political stature of the Prime Minister. Again, we have heard about the role of the Committee of Privileges, and I think the phrase used was it can be cumbersome and tedious. We have seen ministers referred on to previous Prime Ministers, and I must say this happens in Cardiff as well with the First Minister there. In both instances, there is the same risk of party considerations and immediate political priorities overriding the common ethical good. It holds true in both places. So to close, Chair, recent events have shown that we need to take greater preventative steps to safeguard polluting public discourse with blatant untruths. Now, I believe, and this is what I propose here, in a democracy, this should be a collective action enshrined in law, not a privileged act of patronage granted or withheld on the grounds of party political interests. And why does all this matter? To me, it's because politics is ethics in action. And the alternative, if we do not safeguard that, is that it is self-interest in action. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you. SNP spokesman, Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Mrs Murray, and I thank my honourable friend, the member from Lithgow and East Falkirk, on opening this debate and bringing this petition to us, and indeed to all those who have signed each of those petitions. I think they have to be commended in bringing this, and their foresight in many ways in bringing this before many of the issues that have been touched on this afternoon even came to light. We live in strange and turbulent times, and there is a danger we're slipping into an era of post-truth politics. You only have to look over the Atlantic to the United States to see the current situation there, where a former president is denying the outcome of an election still, years after it's happened, and the impact that's having on their society. And if we don't do something, I'm not saying I've got all the answers to that, but if we don't do something, there is a danger that we slide down that same slope. We look at the situation that has been touched on by others, and the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who lied to the public and Parliament. He was found to have done so by independent ethics advisers and to have found to have broken the ministerial code after being found guilty by the Met Police investigation for his lies. Yet nobody in this place could call him out for it. Surely it's our job to come here to this place to hold these people to account and the systems to account. And to paraphrase an Australian politician who used a much pithier phrase, we need to keep the scoundrels honest. The public wants politicians to be honest and to have integrity. They're sick and fed up of politicians who think they can have one rule for themselves and one for everyone else. And the reality is, surely that's the very least that our public should be able to expect from us. I thought it was very interesting the honourable member for Tiverton and Honiton suggests we need to throw out the dead cat strategy. I would entirely agree with him. There maybe one or two Lib Dem bar charts could go with it, yeah. But that's perhaps another matter entirely. Now, University College London research published last year revealed that UK public want politicians who operate within the rules over and above delivering outcomes. Their report, What Kind of Democracy Do People Want?, details the responses of 6,500 people, representative of voting age population across the whole UK, who were surveyed in July 2021. The report, which is the most in-depth to date in terms of asking people about what roles institutions should play, shows UK voters care about how those in power are held to account, and it's notably higher support for judicial intervention than is often supposed. It reveals people do not want power concentrated in the hands of a few, but would like it shared among Parliament, judges, regulators and civil servants and the public. When asked whether respondents agreed more that healthy democracy requires that politicians always act within the rules, or that healthy democracy means getting things done, even if that sometimes requires politicians to break the rules, 75% chose the former and just 6% the latter. Professor Alan Rennick, the Deputy Director of the UCL Constitution Unit, said, "It's true that a few people pay much attention to the fine details of democratic institutions, but people do want a system in which politicians act with integrity and where power isn't unduly concentrated with ministers in government. Most people across different political affiliations think it's not the case at present. The findings show voters care deeply about the integrity and do not want power to be unduly concentrated in the hands of the executive. It's beyond doubt that this trust gap between public and politicians is threatening our democracy. And as I say, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson have accelerated the slide, but unless we halt the political disinformation, democracy is in deep, deep trouble. I've previously highlighted the possibility, and perhaps would be very interested to hear the Minister's thoughts on perhaps the need for a truth czar or a truth commissioner to fact-check MPs and hold us to account, because if we clearly can't have a situation where we're doing it ourselves, although in an ideal world we would, but that's what we've got just now and it's not working. And it can't be, I think the honourable member for the Ronda is absolutely right, it would be entirely unfair to expect the Speaker to sit into that situation, but somebody has to. So I think we need to give some serious consideration to that. And it could be an independent body that would be entirely separate from the political system and could give confidence not only to those of us in this place but to the public at large. It could have the power to investigate allegations of dishonesty from MPs and recommend sanctions, such as suspension from the House. This is more than naming and shaming MPs who make mistakes, and because mistakes happen in every workplace, in every organisation. And I do think there's huge merit in the honourable member for Meredith's bill, which I would hope to see progressing with a lot of support, because I think we need to be doing something, because if we don't, then the entire foundations of our democracy are in danger of falling into disrepair. Case in point, Mrs Murray, recently a minister, for avoidance of naming anyone, a minister made a comment that in the chamber that Scotland does not house refugees. Now, you could, if you're being fair, argue it's a throwaway line, a flippant comment, but it's factually entirely untrue. It was pointed out through a point of order for myself, but I've not yet ever seen a correction to that. That's a very simple case where somebody could have a look at that, look at the fact, check it, and the easiest situation is the record is corrected. But at the moment, there's nothing to make that happen. There are other moves afoot. In Iceland, all major political parties have agreed to a code of conduct that includes provisions for transparency, accountability and ethical behaviour. Perhaps there's a model there already existing that we could look at least bring ourselves a bit further forward in terms of what actions we could take. Public anger over dishonesty in politics runs deep. There's a deep-seated view that it's one rule for politicians and another for the rest of us. And a small number of people making wildly sort of flamboyant claims undermine all of us. It impacts every single one of us. It's in all of our interests to try and do everything we can to get this right. And the UCL experts showed that most people are outraged at the suggestion they should have to use up the one vote they get every 4 or 5 years to make what they think should be the blindingly obvious point that lying in Parliament ought to be punished. They expect politicians to step up and enforce the rules. If that doesn't happen, they could increasingly support the more stringent and perhaps problematic external constraints in Parliament. And there is nothing in that for any of us, so it's in all our interests to get this right. Thank you.
Thank you. Shadow Minister, Dame Niall Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Murray. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for leading the debate today on the subject determined by the Petitions Committee, but clearly one of his, really from the heart as he spoke, and on this very, very important matter of honesty in politics and how MPs can be made more accountable for what they say in public and in Parliament, and for explaining to us the intent of the petitions very clearly. Shockingly, we all know why the issue of MPs telling the truth has become a matter of such public concern over the past few years. Whilst people up and down the country were making huge sacrifices to comply with the COVID rules and help keep us all safe, with families not able to be with their loved ones in their dying moments, friends not able to attend funerals, businesses struggling, and young people missing out on education and social contact, we discover that there were parties in number 10 Downing Street. And as if that were not enough, to add insult to injury, We then had the unedifying spectacle, that's very, very modest language, Mrs Murray, of the then Prime Minister himself, in denial, squirming around and changing his story at the dispatch box. And you can understand why the leader of the Labour Party, my right honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, called for him to be referred to the Committee of Privileges. The problem, as we all know, is that this behaviour by the former Prime Minister has completely shattered the public's trust in politics. That's why we have said that for Labour it's a priority to try to restore the trust in politics, to restore standards in public life. And for us, that really has to start from the top. It has to start with the Prime Minister and government. It is of paramount importance that all MPs should be honest, but clearly the influence and impact of what ministers say is much greater. They affect people's spending decisions, they affect people's planning decisions, they are crucial in terms of what the future of the country holds. We cannot continue with the current situation where the Prime Minister appoints his own ethics advisor, who can only instigate investigations on the say-so of the Prime Minister, and furthermore, any sanctions can only be imposed with the agreement of the Prime Minister. Sadly, for all the rhetoric, the current Conservative government has done precious little to restore the public's trust in politicians. Now, we have set out very clearly that if we are elected to government, then Labour would create a genuinely independent standards watchdog, the Ethics and Integrity Commission, completely independent of political control, which would oversee and enforce standards in government, ending the current situation in which the Prime Minister is the judge and jury on every case of ministerial misconduct. The current independent advisor on ministers' interests and the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, which advises on former ministers taking up jobs, would be subsumed into this new Ethics and Integrity Commission. And the new commission would have the powers to launch investigations without ministerial approval into misconduct and breaches of the Ministerial Code, put forward sanctions for breaches of the Ministerial Code, recommend changes to ensure the Ministerial Code is fit for purpose, and insist that former ministers apply to the Commission before accepting any job, and ban former ministers from lobbying, consultancy or any paid work related to their former job. That's how we want to clean up government. But as I said, disappointingly, in the light of events described by honourable members today, the government has not brought forward proposals for that much-needed reform to create independence within the system. Now, when it comes to MPs, that has traditionally been a matter for the House of Commons and the Speaker. And I thank the honourable members today who've taken part and have suggested their proposals for how things could be improved. My honourable friend, the member for the Rhondda, the honourable member speaking for the Liberal Democrats who represents Tiverton and Honiton, and my right honourable friend, the member for Dwyfol Meirionnydd, leader of Plaid Cymru, together, of course, with the spokesperson for the SNP front bench. It's an important feature of our democracy that we safeguard freedom of speech and that we should be able to express ourselves forthrightly. And inevitably, there will be strong differences of opinion. And the question is, how do we uphold the highest standards in the House, whilst at the same time safeguarding freedom of speech? How effectively do the current procedures work? Back in April 2022, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, called on the Speaker to allow a debate on a motion to refer the then Prime Minister to the Committee of Privileges for, and I quote, appearing to amount to misleading the House. In the event, the motion was agreed nem con, and as we know, a referral did take place and sanctions were imposed, including a 90-day suspension, which would have allowed a recall petition had the member not resigned. So democratically elected members were able to do the right thing and back, or at least not oppose, the investigation of a fellow member, albeit he the Prime Minister, for misleading the House. However, the day before, government ministers had been minded to table an amendment to the motion. So maybe there's a case for a stronger ministerial code which would prevent that. And as my honourable friend, the member for the Rhondda, has put on record, there are real concerns about this process and potential for streamlining it. But as I've said, when it comes to MPs and their conduct in the Chamber, that has traditionally been a matter for the House of Commons and the Speaker. But it behoves each one of us not to tarnish the reputation of Parliament through knowingly lying to, or misleading, as it's always said, the House, and therefore lying to the public. And I'm sure the majority of members do endeavour to be truthful the majority of the time. But as members have pointed out today, you're more likely to get into trouble and be thrown out if you point out that another MP has lied than if you are actually the perpetrator of the lie in the first place. Now, whilst there are a number of ways in which a minister can correct the record, this is not the case for MPs who can choose to make a correction by, for example, using a point of order, as has been pointed out today, but then there is no referencing of that to their original statement, which remains in Hansard. And as my honourable friend, the member for the Rhondda, and former chair of the Standards Committee, has in today's debate pointed out, how it could be made easier for an MP to make that correction and for the information to be more accessible. And I would be very interested to hear from the Government Minister what thought Government has given to that proposal and what the Government's position will be on the amendment when it is put to Parliament. I'd also like to ask the Minister what discussions he's had with the Leader of the House and the Speaker about ways to foster a zero-tolerance culture towards telling lies and repeating lies in the House, and what ways he may have discussed to rebuild trust in Parliament. Now, my honourable friend, the member for the Rhondda, and the member for Tiverton and Honiton have explained what the complications could be of making it a criminal offence for MPs to lie to Parliament or to the public. And we've also heard from the member for Doivo Merioneth, who's explained how she envisages her 10-minute rule bill would work, making it a criminal offence for MPs to lie to Parliament or to the public. But as has been said, this has to be led from the top, which is why we in the Labour Party think it very important to get the role of the Prime Minister and the Ministerial Code and the idea of an independent ethics and integrity commission off the blocks as the starter. But I would like to ask the Minister what proposals his government has for putting right things now. It is extraordinary that in the light of events that have happened, we have not seen any significant action to create any form of independence in respect of ethics and integrity, and also what he would propose in order to ensure that we have a better culture in Parliament, that we have a better understanding of what honesty in politics means, and that we can actually demonstrate to the public that we are really trying to clean up our act. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and look, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to respond in this very important debate, this wide-ranging debate, which touches, as a number of members have said, on one of the fundamentals of the Constitution, the unwritten Constitution, the relationship that we all have, not just with the public, but with each other, that everyone in society has with one another. Honesty. Without honesty, democracy cannot work properly. Society cannot work properly either. And, to all credit to members on all sides of the House, that everyone has raised important examples of where we have been. This side of the House is represented, and it's being represented to you now, Mr. It's very important that we can, with credit to members across the floor, they've raised important examples of where members have been found wanting, and often, or not examples from within their own parties, of course, but examples nonetheless. And I toyed with the idea of finding examples from the SNP and Plaid Cymru and Liberal Democrat and Labour about dishonesty from within their ranks, but we all know that that's out there, and I don't wish to engage in that sort of knockabout, much as the honourable lady opposite tempted me by not mentioning certain things that occurred when her party was last in power. Now, the question before us through these petitions is how do we wish to improve honesty, and the petitions actually obviously set out a particular route. The question for us is whether that is the right route, whether that's an appropriate route. And I have to be clear with the House immediately. I don't think it is, for reasons raised by the honourable member from Rhondda. You see, if honesty is one of the core values of our system, then parliamentary privilege and the freedom of speech within Parliament is one of the absolute pillars of the modern constitution, not just the modern constitution. The Bill of Rights in 1689, Article 9, that the freedom of speech and debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in court or placed outside of Parliament, or perhaps closer to the heart of the honourable gentleman who brought the debate, the claim of right, 1689, from the Convention of the Estates in Scotland, that for redress of grievances and for the amending, strengthening and preserving of the laws, Parliaments ought to be frequently called and allowed to sit, and the freedom of speech and debate secured to all members. To all members. This wasn't a new idea in the late 17th century. We know that it was a principle upheld in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, that there is a case from 1455, a case of a man called Young, who had been proved that he had been unduly punished because of something he'd said in the House. And the House agreed, quote, "The old liberty and freedom of the commons of this land to speak and say in the House without manner of challenge or punishment." And so even in 1455, this was considered to be an old privilege. There are examples from the late 14th century which may show likewise, but they're more contested. That one of the founding principles, it would seem, of parliamentary debate is that people should be free from interference when they speak. And it stands to reason that within Parliament, people will not always agree. Now, of course, that doesn't give everyone the right to say whatever they like. There are, but the House has means of regulating its own behaviour. The example that the honourable gentleman from Rhondda gave was far better than the made-up example I had in my head, actually, because the consequences of success for petitions like these is that the honourable gentleman will stand up and make a criticism of an oligarch. And that oligarch will have deep pockets, very deep pockets. And they will find a way to get him into court. And even if he wins, he would have done, he might find that legal process very expensive. So expensive that the next time he stood up, he might genuinely think twice about what he said. And not just him. Every single member of the House would think twice before they spoke on a contentious issue. And that would have a supremely damaging effect on discourse, on the honesty of discourse, because honesty is not just about what you say. It's sometimes about what you choose not to say, sometimes about what you choose not to stand up against. So I don't believe it would stop there, Madam Chair. I think you'd have individuals who were rich and sought to intimidate members of the House, but you would also have organisations, campaigning organisations, who would have very deep pockets. And they would go after individuals who spoke on certain subjects, and they would seek to clamp down on debate in certain areas. And that would have a very damaging effect on our democracy. You see, that is why, my opinion of the government, the House has to grant these privileges and has to find means and mechanisms for self-regulation. It's why it's such an important, long-standing principle. Now, we, honourable members, have raised interesting ideas about how those processes could be improved. I won't go into those today, but it's good that they've had their opportunity to air them here. But in terms of this petition, if we were to accept the ideas put down, we would be sanctioning the legal intimidation of MPs in the House of Commons. And I'm afraid that is something that this government will not support.
Martyn Day, to sum up.
Thank you very much, Mrs Murray. We've had a very good, wide-ranging debate here today. I think we've probably only scratched the surface of what could have been said, but we've heard basically that it's very difficult for members who genuinely wish to correct inadvertent mistakes to do so. And it's nigh on impossible to hold people who deliberately mislead Parliament to actual account, and there's no ultimate sanction other than the electorate at the ballot box, and that isn't really a proper sanction at all. So there definitely is something we need to do if we're to restore public faith in our democratic processes. We have to send a message, and I think the debate we've had today here has helped do that, that honesty is not out of fashion, but we've got to make sure that there is repercussions when people willfully mislead Parliament, and I hope the Minister will reconsider his position. Thank you.
Yeah.
The question is that this House has considered e-petitions 561730 and 576886 relating to honesty in politics. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended.